Some places in this world carry a darkness that no amount of sunlight can erase, not because of what people believe, but because of what has actually been witnessed, recorded, and reported by ordinary people living ordinary lives until one day something extraordinary shattered everything they thought they knew. Tonight, we venture into one of those places, the Blackwood House. Located on the outskirts of Salem, Oregon, a town already soaked in the history of witch trials and dark folklore. But what happened inside 4412 Ridgecroft Lane was not folklore, it was not myth, it was documented, investigated, and witnessed by multiple credible sources over a span of 40 years. This is their story. It's 1983. Ronald and Patricia Calloway are a young couple in their early 30s, recently married, full of hope. Ronald works as a civil engineer. Patricia is a school teacher. Together, they have a combined savings of $42,000, enough, they believe, to finally purchase their first home. The listing for the property at Ridgecroft Lane seemed almost too good to be true. A 4-bedroom Victorian-style home, built in 1901, situated on a generous half-acre lot at the edge of the Willamette Valley. The asking price was $38,000, well below market value for the area. Their realtor, a man named Gerald Briggs, was somewhat evasive when they asked why it had been sitting on the market for 3 years. He simply said, and these are his documented words in a local newspaper interview from 1991, "The previous owners left quickly. They didn't give a forwarding address." Patricia later recalled that when she first walked through the front door of the Blackwood House, she experienced an overwhelming sensation of being watched. Not the pleasant feeling of being welcomed into a space, but something cold, something with intent. She ignored it. Everyone ignores the first signs. They moved in on October 4th, 1983. The first 2 weeks passed without incident. Ronald fixed the plumbing. Patricia repainted the kitchen a warm shade of yellow. Their cat, Miso, a gray tabby they'd had for 6 years, refused to enter the house. For the entire duration of their stay at the Blackwood House, Miso would only sleep in the garage. Animal behaviorists note that cats often respond to infrasound frequencies that humans cannot detect, frequencies that have been linked in several studies to sensations of dread and unease. But Ronald and Patricia were not scientists, they were homeowners, and they were happy. For 14 days. October 18th, 1983, 2:47 in the morning. Patricia woke to the sound of a child crying. She sat up in bed, groggy and confused. They had no children. The nearest neighbors were half a mile away. Ronald was asleep beside her. She listened. The crying was coming from inside the house, specifically from the room directly below their bedroom, the room they had designated as a guest room. A room that had been locked since they moved in because the key the realtor had given them hadn't worked on that particular door. Patricia woke Ronald. Together, they went downstairs. The crying had stopped. The guest room door was closed, as always. Ronald pressed his ear to the wood. Silence. He rattled the handle. Locked, as always. They went back to bed. Patricia wrote about this in her personal diary, a diary that would later be reviewed by a paranormal investigator named Dr. Helen Marsh in 1997. Dr. Marsh noted that the description of the crying was almost identical to accounts from the family who had lived in the house before the Calloways, the Delaney family, who had vacated the property in 1980 under circumstances that were, according to public records, deeply troubling. We'll return to the Delaneys, but first, let's stay with the Calloways, because the night of October 18th was just the beginning. Over the next 3 weeks, Patricia documented the following events in her diary. October 21st. Every mirror in the house was found facing the wall in the morning. Ronald had no memory of moving them. Patricia had not moved them. October 24th.
Ronald reported that while working in his study, he felt a hand on his shoulder, a firm, deliberate grip. He turned around. No one was there. The sensation, he said, lasted for what felt like nearly a minute. October 29th. Patricia came home from school to find every cabinet in the kitchen hanging open. The contents, plates, cups, canned goods, had been arranged in a neat line down the center of the kitchen floor. No item was broken. Nothing was spilled. The arrangement had a deliberate, almost ritual quality to it. They did not call the police. People rarely do in these early stages, because to call the police is to acknowledge that something is wrong, and acknowledging something is wrong means accepting that you cannot explain it, and most of us, faced with the inexplicable, choose denial. It is the most human of instincts. But then came Halloween night.
October 31st, 1983. Ronald and Patricia had decided to give out candy to trick-or-treaters, despite the fact that they lived on a rural road and expected few visitors. They carved a pumpkin together. Patricia made hot cider. Ronald put on a record, some classic Sinatra, and for a while it felt like any other evening in any other home in America. 3 children came to the door in the early evening. Ronald handed out candy bars. The children ran back down the long gravel driveway. Patricia watched them from the doorstep. And then one of the children stopped. A little girl in a witch costume. She turned around and stared up at the house, not at Patricia, not at Ronald, but at the upper floor window, the locked room. The girl raised her hand and waved. Patricia followed the girl's gaze to the window, and there, for just a moment, she saw the outline of a figure, small, child-sized, standing at the glass. They had not been able to open the locked room door since moving in. Patricia screamed. Ronald came running. By the time they both looked at the window, the figure was gone. The children in the driveway had fled, startled by the scream. The Calloways stood in their doorway in silence, looking up at a dark, empty window, with Sinatra still playing softly somewhere inside the house behind them. That night, Ronald Calloway finally broke down the door to the locked room. What he found inside would stay with him for the rest of his life. The room was small, a child's room, though it had not been furnished as one by the Calloways. The walls were bare plaster. The floor was hardwood. In the center of the room sat a single wooden chair, a child's chair, small enough for a toddler. And on the floor around the chair, drawn in what appeared to be chalk, were letters, dozens of letters, scratched in a childish hand, repeating the same word over and over and over again, spiraling outward from the chair in a widening circle. The word was stay. To understand what the Calloways were facing, we need to go back before them, back to the family who had lived in the Blackwood House from 1974 to 1980, the Delaneys. Thomas and Ruth Delaney moved into the property with their 2 children, 8-year-old James and 5-year-old Clara, in the spring of 1974. Thomas worked at the local lumber mill. Ruth was a homemaker. By all accounts, they were a quiet, unremarkable family. That would change by the winter of 1975. Clara Delaney began speaking to someone who wasn't there, not in the vague, unfocused way that young children sometimes do, but in specific, directed conversations. She would sit in her bedroom, the small room that would later become the locked room of the Calloway era, and speak clearly and calmly to an empty corner of the room. When Ruth asked Clara who she was talking to, Clara said, "The boy who lives here. He doesn't want us to leave." Ruth dismissed this as imagination. Children often create vivid imaginary companions. But by early 1976, James, the older, more skeptical sibling, began to report the same thing. He told his father that he could hear a boy crying in the walls at night, that the crying moved, traveling from room to room,
from wall to ceiling, as if something was crawling through the spaces inside the house. Thomas Delaney was not a superstitious man. He was a practical man, a working man. He hired a contractor to inspect the walls for pests or structural issues. The contractor found nothing. The crying continued. By 1977, Ruth Delaney had begun leaving every light in the house on at night. She refused to go into the small upstairs room that Clara had claimed as her own. Clara, meanwhile, seemed perfectly comfortable, more than comfortable. She seemed content in a way she hadn't been before, almost eerily serene. Ruth would later describe this period to a journalist as watching my daughter be replaced, slowly, by something that wore her face but didn't laugh the same way.
In March of 1978, Thomas Delaney contacted the local Catholic diocese and requested a house blessing. The priest who came, a Father Michael Callahan, performed the blessing, but afterward refused to discuss what had happened inside the house. He resigned from his post 4 months later. His letter of resignation, obtained through a Freedom of Information request filed by paranormal researcher Dr. Helen Marsh, contained one relevant line: "I have encountered something for which my training has not prepared me." The Delaneys held on for 2 more years. They locked Clara's room, the room she had shared with her invisible companion, in the summer of 1979, after Clara began sleepwalking. They found her one morning standing at the window, staring out into the dark yard below, whispering the word "stay" over and over again. They left in February of 1980. They left without telling the neighbors. They left most of their furniture behind. Thomas Delaney did not give the realtor a forwarding address. Clara Delaney, now in her mid-40s, was tracked down by Dr. Marsh in 1997. She agreed to a recorded interview, but only under condition of anonymity. In that interview, she said, "He wasn't evil. I want people to understand that. He wasn't trying to scare us. He was just lonely. He had been there for a very, very long time, and he didn't want anyone else to leave." Who was the boy? Dr. Helen Marsh spent 6 years investigating the Blackwood House. She combed through local records, census data, death records, and newspapers dating back to the early 1900s. What she pieced together painted a heartbreaking picture. The house was built in 1901 by a man named Elias Blackwood, a timber merchant who had made his fortune in the Oregon logging industry. Elias and his wife Margaret had 4 children. The youngest was a boy named Samuel Blackwood, born in 1903. Samuel never made it to his 7th birthday. In the winter of 1909, the Willamette Valley was struck by a brutal cold snap. A fever swept through the rural communities. Several children in the Salem area died within the span of a few weeks. Samuel Blackwood was one of them. According to a letter written by Margaret Blackwood to her sister in Portland, Samuel died in his bedroom, the small upper room at the back of the house, on the night of January 14, 1910. She wrote, "He called for me all night. I held his hand until the calling stopped. When it was over, the house felt changed, as if something had stayed." Elias Blackwood sold the house in 1914 and moved his family to Portland. In a probate document from 1921, when Elias died, his estate listing includes a notation about the Salem property. In the margin, in Elias's own handwriting, are the words, "Do not return to Ridgecroft. Samuel is still there." Between 1914 and 1974, the house changed hands 9 times. Dr. Marsh was able to track down records from 6 of the 9 families.
5 of the 6 reported unexplained activity. Crying in the walls, mirrors moved, a sense of being watched. 3 of the 5 reported seeing a child in the upstairs window. None of them stayed longer than 2 years. By the time Dr. Helen Marsh arrived at the Blackwood House in the summer of 1997, the property had been vacant for 12 years. The Calloways had left in 1985, having endured 2 years of escalating activity. They had never spoken publicly about their experience until Dr. Marsh found them living quietly in Portland and persuaded them to sit for recorded interviews. Dr. Marsh was not a believer in the traditional sense. She held a doctorate in parapsychology from the University of Edinburgh, one of the few accredited institutions in the world offering serious academic study of paranormal phenomena. She had spent her career applying rigorous scientific methodology to accounts that most of her colleagues dismissed. She used electromagnetic field readers, infrared cameras, audio recording equipment, and she kept meticulous written logs. She would spend 3 weeks in the Blackwood House. Her first night was uneventful. She documented low-level electromagnetic anomalies in the upstairs hallway, consistent, she noted, with old wiring. Nothing remarkable. Her second night, she placed audio recorders throughout the house before going to sleep in a cot in the main living room. In the morning, she reviewed the recordings. At 2:47 in the morning, the same time Patricia Calloway had first heard the crying 14 years earlier, one of the recorders in the upstairs hallway captured a sound, a child crying. Dr. Marsh had the recording analyzed by 3 independent audio engineers. All 3 confirmed it was not a recording artifact, not interference, not an animal. It was a human child's voice, crying. On her 4th night, Dr. Marsh set up infrared cameras in the small upper room, the room where Samuel Blackwood had died, the room Clara Delaney had shared with her invisible companion, the room where Ronald Calloway had found the word "stay" written on the floor. At 3:12 in the morning, the infrared camera recorded a thermal anomaly in the corner of the room, a shape, roughly the size of a 6-year-old child, stationary for 11 minutes and 43 seconds. Then it was gone. Dr. Marsh's report, published in the Journal of Parapsychological Research in 1999 under the title Persistent Residual Manifestations, a Case Study in Longitudinal Haunting, concluded that the Blackwood House represented one of the most compelling and consistently documented cases of paranormal activity in the Pacific Northwest. She stopped short of using the word ghost. Instead, she used the phrase residual energy of sufficient magnitude to produce measurable, repeatable physical phenomena. Make of that what you will. In 2008, a family finally returned to the Blackwood House. 23 years after the Calloways had fled, the property was purchased at auction for a fraction of its market value by a man named David Okafor, a Nigerian-American software engineer who had recently relocated to Salem from Silicon Valley. He had 2 daughters, aged 9 and 12. He had not researched the history of the house. David's older daughter, Maya, was assigned the small upper room as her bedroom, partly because she was the eldest, partly because it had the nicest afternoon light. His younger daughter, Zoe, had the larger room across the hall. David Okafor, to his credit, did not dismiss his daughter. He researched the house, found the newspaper articles, found Dr. Marsh's published paper, and eventually found Dr. Nguyen. He did not, however, leave.
This was unprecedented in the history of the Blackwood House. Every previous family had eventually fled. David Okafor decided to stay. He continued to correspond with Dr. Nguyen. He began keeping his own logs. He documented his daughter's conversations with the entity she called simply the boy. According to Maya's account,
recorded with her consent when she was 15 and later reviewed by Dr. Nguyen. The boy had told her several things: that he was cold, that he had been cold for a very long time, that everyone who came to the house eventually left, and every time someone left, the cold got worse, that he was frightened, not of the living, but of what he might become if the cold continued. David Okafor, on the advice of a local spiritual counselor, not a priest, not a scientist, but a woman from the local Native American community who had her own understanding of land and spirit and memory, began performing a simple ritual each evening. He would sit in the small upper room, he would light a candle, and he would speak quietly to the empty corner of the room. He would say, "You are not alone. We are here. You can rest."
The activity in the house did not stop immediately, but over the following months, according to David's logs, it diminished. The crying in the walls became less frequent. The thermal anomalies, which he had learned to detect with a basic infrared thermometer, became smaller, briefer. Maya continued to speak to the boy in her room, but she told her father that he seemed slowly to be changing, less desperate, less urgent. In late 2010, she told her father, "He said he thinks he might be ready now. He said he just needed someone to tell him it was okay to go." After that, Maya no longer spoke to anyone invisible in her room. The crying stopped. The mirrors stayed where they were put. Miso, well, there was no Miso, but the Okafor's dog, a golden retriever named Biscuit, began sleeping at the foot of Maya's bed rather than outside the door. The Okafor family lived in the Blackwood House until 2019, when David's job took them to Chicago. By all accounts, their last 11 years in the house were unremarkable, quiet, ordinary, happy. The house is currently on the market.
So what do we make of the Blackwood House? Was Samuel Blackwood truly there for over a century in the cold of that small upper room, waiting? Was Elspeth Tanner still standing by that dry well in Queensland, watching the living move through a world she could no longer fully reach? Or are these simply the stories we tell ourselves, shaped from grief and fear and the desperate human need to believe that love, even the love of a child for the warmth of a home, does not simply end? I don't have the answer. I'm not sure anyone does. But I know this: every family that walked through the door of 4412 Ridgecroft Lane felt something. Some fled, some endured, and one remarkable family chose to respond not with fear, but with compassion. And if the logs and the testimony and the absence of sound in that house are to be believed, it made all the difference. Thank you for spending this time with us here at the Haunted Territory. If you are new to this channel, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new investigation. If today's story moved you, leave a comment below. I read every single one. Stay curious, stay open, and remember, not every haunting is what it seems.